for that kind of shot, I very much prefer my over my. In these situations, I wouldn't want to change my camera for any camera out there. So, crop versus full frame, which is better? First and foremost, what is a crop sensor and what is a full frame sensor? To make things as easy as possible, let me show you this very basic representation of a camera. I have a lens in front, and within the body is a white rectangle that has the same size as a full frame sensor. As you can see, that sensor would capture a certain image. If the sensor was smaller, it could not capture the same image, but only a smaller part of it. A crop, so to say. And that's why they are called crop sensor cameras. Some weirdos get mad over the terms crop sensor and full frame sensor. I'm not creating this video to discuss semantics though, but rather practical photography. But just to put them at ease too, full frame is often referred to as 35mm. Since there are so many different crop sensor sizes out there, let me just name the most popular ones: APS-C and MFT. And if I'd add, for example, the newest iPhone to the pack, its sensor would be even smaller than that. How can you compare these to one another, particularly when buying lenses for your system? Let me do an experiment. I will photograph myself and will use the same lens on different cameras. First with a full frame camera, then with a Canon T7i that has an APS-C sized sensor, and with my Olympus that has a Micro Four Thirds sensor. If we compare these images side by side, we see that the full frame sensor has the widest angle of view, the APS-C is more narrow, and the Micro Four Thirds sensor is even more narrow. Comparing the full frame to the Micro Four Thirds, I can show you one crucial fact. If I zoom in to 200% on the full frame image, I get the same magnification that I get with the Micro Four Thirds sensor. 200%, so that's double. But what if I didn't do that to the final image, but rather double the focal length? Let me shoot another image with my full frame camera, and instead of using the 100mm that I used before, I zoom into 200mm, so I double the focal length. And we get a very similar image. All we had to do to get a comparable image is increase the focal length by the factor 2. And that's how you can compare the same focal length for different sensors, with a factor. That factor is called crop factor. For MFT, the crop factor is super easy. It is 2 as we have already seen. So to compare the field of view of full frame to that of an MFT sensor, you have to double its focal length. 100mm MFT is equivalent to 200mm full frame, hence the factor 2. Here is a list of other crop factors. Most camera manufacturers use an APS-C sensor with a crop factor of 1.5 so 100mm APS-C would be equivalent to 150mm full frame. Canon's APS-C sensor, however, has a crop factor of 1.6 so 100mm would be equivalent to 160mm. Translate that to a wildlife photo where you typically want a longer reach, and you get the first and probably biggest advantage of crop sensors. Let's say you use a 300mm lens. You'd get 450mm on Sony, Nikon, Fuji and others, 480mm on Canon and 600mm on MFT sensors. That's quite a dramatic difference. But for a thorough crop versus full frame comparison, I need to relativize that statement. You can obviously also crop in post, for example in Photoshop. Let's assume we have an image of a Sony a7R5. That's the full frame camera with the biggest resolution on the market as of now. It has a whopping resolution of 9504 by 6336 pixels, which is roughly 60 million pixels or 60 megapixels. If I chose crop out an image with a crop factor of 1.5 I'd get a resolution of 6178 by 4120 pixels, which would be roughly 25 megapixels. Many APS-C sensors have a resolution of 6000 by 4000 pixels or 24 megapixels. So in this case, the difference between shooting a full frame camera and cropping in Photoshop versus shooting an APS-C sensor is negligible. So is there actually no real advantage of the APS-C sensor? Well, first and foremost, don't forget that we have been talking about the camera with the highest available resolution. Let's try the same with a different camera. Let's take a full-frame Canon R6 Mark II, which has 24 megapixels, and crop an image with a 1.5 crop factor in Photoshop. The crop we will now get is only 3900 by 2600 pixels, which results in 10 megapixels, and that's not all that much. So whether cropping from a full frame image gives you a bigger final magnification of your subject and therefore a bigger resolution of it, logically depends on the resolution you're cropping the full frame image from. But that's still only half the truth. Let me compare the crop from the Sony 60 megapixel full frame image on the left to the image of the APS-C sensor camera with the highest current resolution, the Fuji X-T5, which has 40 megapixels on the right. I admit that looks pretty messy, so let me just quickly resize the two so that we get a better comparison. So suddenly the image from the crop sensor camera is quite a bit bigger. And if we now replace the crop from the Sony 60 megapixel camera with the crop from the Canon R6 Mark II with 24 megapixels, the difference gets massive. That's no Canon bashing, by the way. We could use the Sony a7 III that also has 24 megapixels and get the very same result. So to get the biggest subject resolution possible, for example for wildlife shots, you need a crop sensor. But you can't compare apples to oranges. So the first point goes to APS-C sensors, because for wildlife, sports, etc., they just give you a longer reach. Talking about apples again, a mistake that people very often make when they compare crop versus full frame is again comparing apples to oranges. They compare, for example, the cheapest entry-level APS-C camera, for example the Canon T7, to the highest end full frame camera. In the Canon lineup, that would currently be the R3. That's not a fair comparison. You'd rather have to compare a high-end APS-C to a high-end full frame camera, because there is more to a camera than just the sensor size. So you cannot think, oh, I get the Canon T7 because if I crop the 60 megapixel image of the Sony a7R4, I'll get the same image that I'd get from the Canon T7. The better sensor technology, better processors, etc. not only improve the low light performance, but also dynamic range, colors, focus speed, etc. Very likely the noise you'd get on a high-end full-frame camera would easily be 4 times less than on an entry-level crop sensor. If you seriously compare full-frame versus crop, you would have to compare cameras with the same sensor technology. Just keep in mind though that a low-end full-frame sensor still has better built-in technology than an entry-level crop sensor camera. With the latter, camera manufacturers try to save every penny just to have the most affordable camera on the market. And that brings us to the next point of crop versus full-frame. 99% of photographers would tell you that full-frame cameras have the better low-light performance, or in other words, lower noise at the same ISO setting. Before we discuss that, let me introduce you to this guy, who is the sponsor of today's video. Correct? It's me. I am working on a few photography courses that will change how people teach photography forever. The basic course will even be free, but there will also be some very affordable paid courses. There will be general photography courses, very well structured flash photography courses, or in other words lighting, advanced composition and whatnot. They are created with learning psychology in mind, so you will keep what you learned instead of forgetting it again after a few days or weeks. All you have to do to get notified when the courses are ready is to subscribe to my mailing list. There's also a link in the description of this video. Okay, back to comparing sensors. Does a full-frame sensor have better low-light performance? Well, that again depends. In my upcoming photography course, I will teach you that the pixels of every single sensor do nothing more than collect light particles to determine image brightness. If we have a look at this red pixel, we see that it counts a certain amount of light particles. But if I make that pixel bigger, it will obviously be able to collect more light particles, just like a bigger bucket can collect more rain. So a bigger sensor logically collects more light. And the more light the sensor collects, the less gain you have to apply. Gain in photography is known as ISO. So the more light the sensor collects, the lower the ISO setting that you can choose. And that again means that you get less noise. Long story short, a bigger sensor creates less noise. There is a small exception, but we will get to that soon. So without getting any further into detail, this is a point for full-frame sensors. On we go to the third big difference that is often talked about, the depth of focus or depth of field, if you will. Do you remember my self-portraits? There was a reason why I chose the Christmas lights in the background. For me personally, when I choose my full-frame camera over my crop sensor cameras, I do that mainly because I'm a background blur junkie. I just love it when my subject, in this case me, separates from the background. You will say, but Wolf, that's what you have the aperture for. But believe it or not, that also has to do a lot with sensor size. Let's take 3 different images again. I will still use the 100mm lens, but this time I will move the camera to approximately have the same field of view on all 3 cameras. Have a look at the blur of the Christmas lights. you see that the full frame image shows a lot more blur than the APS-C image. And that again has more blur than the MFT sensor. Some people will argue,
but you can make up for that with a smaller f number.
Theoretically, yes. Let's have a look at the available lenses for portrait photography, because that is mostly an issue when shooting portraits. At 85mm, which is the most popular focal length for portraits, you get 85mm f1.4 or even f1.2 for full frame. You can obviously also use them on crop sensor cameras. Using the same lenses on a crop sensor camera would again result in less background blur. To get a comparable amount of background blur, you not only have to multiply the focal length with the crop factor, but also the f number. 50mm full frame multiplied by the crop factor is 80mm, so roughly the 85mm of popular portrait lenses. If we do the same calculation for the f number of such portrait lenses, for example f1.4, we get f0.88. And well, there is nothing even close to that available. There is an f0.95 manual focus lens available, but it is tricky to manually focus at such low f numbers, so you wouldn't want to do that for a portrait. For Micro Four Thirds, that is even worse. You need a 40mm f0.7 lens. The closest you'd get with an autofocus lens is f1.2. That's almost the same as using f5.6 versus f2.8. So that is an area of photography where I neither would nor could live without my full frame camera. That's a clear point for full frame sensors. So the background blur is lower on crop sensor cameras. That is due to a bigger depth of focus. But there are situations where you want a bigger depth of focus, for example in macro photography. Actually, the reason why I purchased this Olympus camera is that I love to shoot macro. By the way, I regularly also post macro tutorials here on this channel, so you may want to subscribe. Oh, and I see you haven't liked this video yet. I hope it's not so bad that you can't give it a like. But let's check out the macro example. Here I have a Sony macro lens for my full frame camera and an MFT camera with an equivalent macro lens. If we choose the same composition and compare the full frame to the MFT sensor, we see that there is a difference. It is not massive, but it is there. And that is why most photographers that specialize in macro photograph with an MFT sensor. Most in fact with Olympus, because they have quite a few nice macro features. Oh, and while we are at it, both lenses are 90mm. Let's remember the crop factor in regard to focal length. The 90mm on the Olympus actually is a 180mm lens. So if we keep the same distance to the subject, it magnifies the image twice. Which is pretty helpful because in macro photography you often want as big of a magnification as you can get. So for that area of photography I very much prefer my Olympus crop format camera over my full frame camera. Here is another point for the crop sensor. So is it a tie? No, because there are a few more points we have to discuss. The first is size and weight. A smaller sensor obviously makes the camera smaller and lighter. That doesn't mean though that my MFT camera is just half the size because the sensor has half the size. The difference isn't all that big, to be honest. Much bigger is the difference for lenses that are specifically designed for crop sensors. They are often quite a bit smaller and lighter. However, most professional wildlife photographers still use full frame lenses, so while that is a point for crop sensor, it is not a decisive one. What might be more decisive for many of you is the price. Crop sensor cameras and lenses are definitely more affordable, even if you compare apples to apples. No discussion about that. So another point for crop. Does that mean that crop is the clear winner? You might be tempted to say yes. The truth, however, is there will never be an overall winner, because it depends on what you want to photograph. If you shoot portraits and like blurred backgrounds, you won't be all that happy with a crop sensor, particularly MFT or even smaller. But if you mainly shoot macro, it would be the other way around. Depending how important low light is for you, you might have to weigh that in too. Now that I helped you decide on sensor sizes, let me next help you decide on lenses.